There's so much that Americans take for granted that we will always be number one. China makes over half of the world's steel. What can steel be used for? Well, it's a huge input for your defense industrial base.
Ships, planes, tanks, anything of that order.
Chinese EV makers making something like 60% of all EVs in the world. Chinese battery makers making something like over 70% of the world's batteries.
Could they be turned against us? The scenario that people most fear is that if there was a war, somehow all of those many thousands or even millions of Chinese-made electric vehicles could be weaponized on American soil by a remote power.
If we thought that the first China shock was bad, I think this would be on a whole different order of magnitude.
Friends, we are going to start today's episode in a bit of an unusual way for UnHerd. We are going to quote from the New York Times. Don't go away. I have often been skeptical of their coverage on all sorts of topics, as you will share, no doubt. But a couple of weeks ago, there was a piece by a researcher called Kyle Chan, a guest essay, and it was entitled, "In the Future, China Will Be Dominant, the US Will Be Irrelevant." And it laid out something that has been a bit of a deep fear of mine, which is that while we're all arguing about the definitions of men and women, or whether we should go to 1% or 2% of GDP on military spending, China is eating our lunch. Now, you may take a different view, but by the end of this episode, you will have a lot more facts at your disposal, because I am delighted to say Kyle Chan, who is a postdoctoral researcher in the sociology department at Princeton and an expert on Chinese industry and how it measures up against America, is joining us. Kyle, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
It was a really interesting and I thought important piece, and I thought let's just take the time today to lay out what your concerns are. So take it away. Roughly speaking, Chinese industry is already streets ahead of the United States. Where should we begin?
You can look at steel, aluminum, shipbuilding, traditional industries. You can look at emerging sectors like AI, robotics, clean tech sectors, EVs, batteries, all of it. China's really forging ahead. And I think the contrast couldn't be more striking with what's happening in the United States. So just to step back and set the scene here, we have, so I'm American. I grew up here, and we've just been sort of used to being number one in a lot of the industries that I just laid out. That American companies will be dominant, that you will always find Google or NVIDIA here within America's shores. The reality, though, is changing as we speak. And I would really emphasize here the role that Chinese industrial policy is playing in this process. So China is very deliberately trying to become a leading, if not dominant player across many of the industries I just spoke of and more. The goal is to increase its already colossal share of global manufacturing. So remember, back in 2023, it was something like 30% of global manufacturing. A recent UN estimate projected by 2030, China would reach something like 45%, nearly half of global manufacturing. China has, for decades now, been investing through public investment, through a whole range of policy tools that we can get into, through special joint ventures with foreign companies, including Apple and Tesla, has been trying to boost, upgrade, and improve its own industries and its own private and state-owned firms. And what we're seeing now is the culmination of a lot of that. So if you're following industry by industry, you might be shocked by the rise of BYD and EVs, or you might be shocked if you are in the U.S. Navy by the sheer tonnage of Chinese ships out on the water now. But if you look at it all together, what we see is this trend across the board that I think is only accelerating.
Well, let's go through some of those industries. And let's start with steel, since you led with that. I mean, steel is what most machinery is made of, right? This is a very crucial product for any country to have access to. It's particularly sensitive for us here in the UK because we just had a huge argument as to whether we should keep our very last steel furnace alive. And I believe there was a sort of mini government bailout to do that, but it's still tiny. I mean, we basically can't make anything in steel here in the UK. How dominant is China now in the steel industry?
So China makes over half of the world's steel. You would be surprised to see this chart. If you don't follow China production figures that often, it looks like one of these like VC charts, just skyrocketing exponential up and to the right. China was not always great at steel production. The funny thing is, for a long time in the pre-reform era, you go back to the early decades of the PRC, they tried to boost steel production. They tried to follow a more command economy, Soviet-style model of basically sort of sheer output, whatever it takes, a top-down process. And that yielded, to say the least, very mixed results. A lot of very, very low quality steel, a lot of waste along the way. But still, this sense lingered that steel was, as you pointed out, a key input into the rest of the economy, right? It's not just about the product itself and the jobs that it creates directly. It's about feeding into the auto industry, the shipbuilding industry, into construction, for housing, for real estate. It feeds into a whole host of other industries. And that sense that we should retain that capability, if not boost it, if not augment it ourselves, continued into the reform era in China and to this day. Now, what has changed is the technology. So over time, China brought in foreign companies, foreign steelmakers. I'm thinking especially of steel firms from Japan, Germany, and had them set up production in China to teach Chinese steel plants the latest techniques. Back in the 70s and 80s, China was really behind when it came to actual quality of steel production. A lot of this stuff was not really usable for things like automobiles, for example. But now the idea is you want to stay in the cutting edge of these older industries. They're not so old, as it turns out. There's a lot of new innovations in those industries, and then that feeds into all these other sectors that you're trying to push ahead on.
Right. So does the US still have decent steel making capacity?
On the very, very high end, yes, there is some, but overall, you can see this sort of mirror image effect where as China's steel production is skyrocketing, overtaking the rest of the world combined, the US is sort of slowly stagnating and declining over time. And that's something I know is a huge political topic in the United States, not least because, I forgot to mention, what can steel be used for? Well, it's a huge input for your defense industrial base, right? This idea that
ships, planes, tanks, anything of that order.
Exactly. And should the moment arise, should a major conflict emerge, would you want to have outsourced all that production elsewhere and have to ask other countries to offer to sell you steel in that process? That's a big question that I think people are asking right now.
Well, they've been asking it for a while. Here's the mystery, that this is not a new political topic. I mean, Hillary Clinton was talking about this when she ran. I mean, Joe Biden has talked about it. Trump has obviously talked about it. It's not even contentious between left and right, especially. Everybody seems to agree that more manufacturing at home would be a good thing, and that the kind of expansion of the single global economy went a bit too far and too much technology was given to China. Is anything actually being done about it? Are there any signs of life domestically?
There are some. So you can look at certain sectors, you can look at certain industries. So there is a consensus, I think now, that some of these sectors are important to bring back. There's a consensus that something like semiconductors is extremely important, as we saw during the pandemic with the supply chain crunch, with automakers literally not being able to sell their cars because they're missing that last set of chips to operate. All these issues have brought to the fore the importance of some of these, strategic industries. The question is, what is the U.S. doing about it, and how much of it is, rhetoric, political discourse versus concrete policy action? And there were some efforts. There are ongoing efforts. So again, semiconductors, right? You have the CHIPS Act in the United States trying to bring in, incentivize TSMC, Samsung, a lot of the largest chip manufacturers to build in the United States. And actually this began during Trump 1. So, credit where credit is due. That process, I think, is still ongoing. Other areas, though, I think it's more of a mixed bag.
Yeah, but semiconductors, and we'll probably come on to them, it's a slightly different kettle of fish because that is a high-tech production line. It's mainly robotics. You can kind of imagine US production plants flourishing there. Do you think it is conceivable or feasible that we go back to an era where large chunks of the American population are employed in factories producing steel. Do you think that's a realistic prospect?
No. And it's not even realistic in China. So the funny thing is, this concern about manufacturing capabilities and the concern about manufacturing jobs are not the same thing. And there's a huge amount of automation. You look at actually a number of American industries, production in some industries hasn't fallen so dramatically, but the number of jobs has gone down. And that's because of rising rates of automation in part. This is actually also happening in China too. And this is actually something that the Chinese government is pushing further on. There used to be a time when Beijing was very concerned about jobs, about manufacturing jobs in the future, about its own sort of rust belt in the Northeast. And now some of those concerns seem to have taken a backseat to this sort of relentless push for automation. So the number of robots per worker in China is now among the highest in the world. There are more industrial robots in China than anywhere else.
So it's almost like a double delusion that you hear from politicians. The first is that China, because it has 1 billion people, is just filled with people working in factories doing the kind of beautiful, romantic manual jobs that Americans were doing in the 1950s. That's not true, because actually robots are building these things in China increasingly. And the other delusion is that somehow to onshore them or bring them home is going to recreate that in Detroit or in the Rust Belt or wherever, whilst that ship has sailed. So even if we succeed in increasing our steel capacity, it doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be a whole load more jobs.
That's absolutely right. I think just from a jobs perspective, it doesn't quite make sense. From a national security perspective and from a critical industries perspective, then it could make more sense. But that's a different debate.
Another crucial question here, before we move on from steel, did China do it deliberately? Because again, politicians on both sides of the aisle will say they've been dumping cheap steel. It was almost like a deliberate strategy to make domestic manufacturing non-economical, non-viable, so they would fold and China would then dominate the market. Was it a deliberate strategy by China?
What was deliberate was an effort to ramp up sheer production volumes at such a scale that it would basically not be a limiting factor for all the downstream industries in China that rely on steel. What I don't think was so deliberate was a strategy to push other players, say U.S., Japanese, Indian steelmakers out of the market per se. I think actually steel is, to this day, a relatively protected industry in many different countries and different regions. So there are efforts to kind of shelter against that. But I do think it was very deliberate to create essentially a kind of overproduction, to err on the side of producing too much, of incentivizing local producers, state-owned producers to sort of go all out in ramping up production such that you don't have that being a drag. You know, you might have the opposite problem where you have a lot of this excess steel that you need to figure out where to sell, especially now with the real estate market declining in China or weakening. That used to be a key area to absorb a lot of steel. But then you have other industries like high-speed rail and factory construction that is potentially absorbing some of the slack.
Let's move on to another sector, because I really want to just get a thorough sense of this. So batteries and EVs, which is kind of like Tesla was, almost two sides of the same industry. What's the situation now?
Now we have Chinese EV makers making something like 60% of all EVs in the world. We have Chinese battery makers making something like over 70% of the world's batteries. So you have not only these two industries being very dominated by Chinese firms, but also the whole supply chain going into them. So for EVs, obviously one of the components is batteries, but you also have other EV components. You have sensors now for self-driving cars, for smart driving capabilities. Also, a lot of basic auto parts that would have gone into the traditional auto industry, now those are being made for China's EV industry. In batteries, you have a similar situation. Cathodes, anodes, graphite, synthetic graphite, lithium processing, all of these really crucial inputs China's also very, very dominant in. So when you take it together, you see China bringing in almost the entire supply chain. Obviously, if you get down to the raw materials, now that China has to source from elsewhere. But pretty much every other part of it, every step of the chain, again, you can look at other industries as well, you see a fairly, very strong representation by Chinese firms.
So let's talk about BYD in particular, because of all the examples, that's almost the most kind of jaw-dropping, isn't it? Because a few years ago, no one had heard of BYD. Even 18 months, maybe 2 years ago, people still felt pretty confident that Tesla was the dominant force in electric vehicles. And now you see BYDs in the UK, you see them in the US. They are increasingly dominant in the domestic market in China. What are the statistics there that we need to understand just to put into context how successful they've been?
BYD's revenues, global revenues now total over $100 billion, exceeding that of Tesla's. BYD is now outselling Tesla in markets like Europe, where they had long been the dominant player, even perhaps synonymous with the EV industry. Right now, Tesla is shrinking its share in China quite substantially, mirroring in some ways the dynamics in the smartphone industry in China, where you have Apple originally sort of defining the industry, but then over time losing out to Chinese players like Xiaomi and Huawei. So overall, you do see this incredible rise of, in particular, BYD. I would say that they're almost sort of head and shoulders above even their Chinese competitors.
Right, and we got to get our heads around the fact that the old days of thinking, okay, it's a made in China version, it's a little bit shitty, it's a kind of copy of the gold standard Western version, that's no longer really true, is it? I mean, a BYD car is not only dramatically cheaper than a Tesla or a Western-made electric vehicle. I mean, you can get one, I believe, for £7,000 at the bottom end of the range, which is like far beneath what you can get from other brands. But also, they go 500 miles or more on a single charge. They charge very quickly. I believe there are new developments. I don't know, what's the fastest you can charge your car? You tell me.
Yeah, they just came out with what's called megawatt charging, where you can essentially charge as fast as it takes to fill up a tank of gas at the gas station. So in other words, this used to be one of the main differentiators between a traditional gas-powered car and an EV. And now that gap no longer exists. And actually, now BYD is not the only one. CATL, other Chinese companies have jumped onto this. But there are a whole host of features, it's true, in addition to the price point, that make BYD so competitive. They just recently launched what translates into English as this God's Eye advanced driving assistance system, basically a whole suite of LiDAR sensors, visual sensors that are integrated in a sensor fusion package to basically allow for smart driving capabilities. And they rolled this out across a whole range of models. On top of that, you have this sort of vertical integration across BYD that's also very interesting and makes it so competitive in terms of not only its price point, but the control that it has over the design and the layout of its vehicle. So yes, there was a time when these cars were seen, even in China, as very cheap, sort of a crummy knockoff of a Toyota Camry. They were very directly compared to that, and now that's no longer the case.
Your phrase "God's eye" that you just said, I mean, that gives me a little chill. And I think a lot of our viewers, we've been worried about American-made electric vehicles as being too dominant on the grid, on the machine. It means that you're not actually necessarily in charge of your own destiny. There is something very romantic about the idea that you can just fill up the car with gas and drive off or down a big highway and you're a free American individual, whilst electric vehicles, by contrast, rely on this sort of infrastructure. So you're less free somehow with an electric vehicle. But God's eye, I mean, that's really the dystopian fear, isn't it? That somehow if a lot of citizens here in the West are buying $7,000 or £7,000 Chinese-made cars, they will somehow be controllable by the Chinese machine. Do you think those fears are legitimate?
Yeah, this is a huge issue. This is a huge issue in the United States. This is a huge issue in Europe. There have been long-standing concerns, long before EVs, right? Going back to Huawei about the role of Chinese technology, especially as our worlds become simply more connected to the internet, as technology seems to seep into everything, every part of life. And now that includes our cars. And we're talking about not only GPS tracking, location tracking, but down to the control of the battery management system, the electric drives, there's a lot here. That's why people talk about EVs being smartphones on wheels. They're so connected and they're so sort of advanced as a form of electronics product.
Could they be turned against us? The scenario that people most fear is that if there was a war or genuine hostility between America and China, somehow all of those many thousands or even millions of Chinese-made electric vehicles could be weaponized on American soil by a remote power. I mean, do you think that is something we should worry about?
So I do think the security concerns are real. I will point out an interesting study, an interesting report out in the U.S. actually that came out recently by your favorite publication, the New York Times, where they actually found out, a reporter discovered that I believe it was GM and maybe Ford as well had been tracking drivers' locations over time without them fully realizing it and feeding that data to car insurance companies. So you can understand, if you're a car insurer, why that data is very useful. You can understand maybe from the automaker standpoint why they might want to sell that sort of data. But I think what was shocking and surprising to a lot of people was that this could be something sneaked away in a contract that you kind of sign along with the millions of other pages that you sign when you buy a new car, and not realize that you are ceding power for surveilling and monitoring your car to a third party. So that part, I think, has sent sort of shockwaves through the industry.
Should we be legislating? Should we be blocking them? I mean, how aggressive do you think governments in the West should be against, let's say, Chinese electric vehicles?
So we should definitely be active about trying to figure out this technology, that we shouldn't just say, I hope it all works out. Nothing bad has happened so far. I do think it's a real, genuine security concern. And I think we have to really drill down to the individual parts. So there's different modems, Wi-Fi connections. There's different aspects that I mentioned earlier about battery management systems that we really need to drill down and figure out, how much of this is connected to the internet? How much of this can be controlled remotely? Is there a way to do data storage and connectivity locally only? And it's funny because China has been trying to do this itself for a long time. They're very, very worried. Beijing is very concerned about data sovereignty, about control over its own data, over geographic data, the locations of movements of its own people, and personal information, and trying to keep that within borders. And they have very strict policies requiring that. So it's sort of interesting to see that China is certainly concerned about some of these issues. I think we should be too.
And am I right that ultimately there is a kind of rule within China that if requested by the communist government, companies will have to pass over information? So in theory, data that is being collected about you by your BYD in another scenario could just be handed over to the CCP.
Yeah, I would say that it goes even beyond that law, that rule, just in the sense that Beijing does have a lot of leverage against, of course, state-owned firms, but also private firms. There's a degree to which they could pressure a private company in some way, shape, or form. That maybe it's not so different from what we see in other countries too, but this is a genuine concern.
Incidentally, this is something that always bugs me. What is BYD actually, what does it actually stand for? Because it's now branded as Beyond Your Dreams. I'm presuming that is a kind of Western-friendly sounding rebrand of an original Chinese word. Is that right?
Yeah, I think now it stands for Build Your Dreams.
Build Your Dreams.
Yeah, in Chinese it's Biadi. So that doesn't really help you because, there's a backstory to that I'm not probably the best position to give.
Someone, if you know, please share it in the comments, because I have a hunch that BYD was not originally named as Build Your Dreams. That's been a kind of a makeover. But let's move on from electric vehicles. I mean, it's a terrifying and important example, but there are more. Even in 5G. Again, the conspiracies around this have abounded over recent years. How valid are they, at least in their kind of underlying anxiety?
So there was a really high-profile, I think, UK parliamentary hearing that's recounted in Eva Dou's book, House of Huawei. In this parliamentary hearing, a Huawei spokesperson testified saying that essentially, for telecom equipment to work, for 5G equipment to work, you have to be able to triangulate the location of cell phones. That's sort of the nature of the technology itself. And in that same hearing, I believe that same spokesperson said, this is just true of any telecom equipment maker. Now, does that reassure anyone? I don't know. But I do think that there is this real issue that we're confronting now. Again, with everything becoming more and more connected over time, we now use these 5G towers not just to make phone calls and surf online, but now they're getting connected to our cars. They're getting connected to this sort of Internet of Things, broader internet connectivity, maybe even down to our fridges and televisions and
Power
everything
supply
else.
at home, the lights, the heating.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if anything, the issue has only grown in importance.
Okay, so here's one thing that did confuse me about your piece, Kyle. What we've just talked about is the extreme dominance of the state in the Chinese industrial sector. And yet, what you seem to be calling for is more state intervention in the West, in our own industry. So you're kind of saying in order to compete with China, we need to become more like China.
Well, I would say that there's a spectrum. And the funny thing is, in terms of state intervention and market, sort of free market dynamics. And I think what's interesting is China has tried to create a hybrid. It abandoned its command economy system. It found that to be truly unproductive, really sort of devastating for its own people and its own economy, and not able to compete internationally. And it switched to starting to absorb elements of the West, including some degree of market competition, a somewhat embrace of private entrepreneurs, a wholehearted embrace of technology. And they try to incorporate that even within their state-dominated sectors, where you have this process I call managed competition, where you try to harness the power of market competition. You try to have multiple players operating rather than a single monopoly, say a state-owned telecom company. At the same time, you step in and try to ensure that there are a number of players that are strong enough to compete, that not a single one of them will dominate. Now, the US, I think, has also long been a hybrid system, but in a different way. I think a lot of Americans, for example, might not realize the role of the federal government, of, say, investment in public research, and the role of DARPA, say, in pioneering the entire autonomous vehicle space to begin with. You have a whole host of backstop state support. So, for example, when the U.S. automakers were on the verge of collapse in the global financial crisis, the federal government stepped in and bailed them out. And I would count that also as a form of state support that I don't think we often think about.
We're going to have to talk about Donald Trump. We've managed to avoid that so far. But your argument is that his actions so far are making this worse, not better. You're concerned, as I understand it, about some of the university action, that it's actually cutting off crucial funding that develops these industries of the future. And you're not that big a fan of the tariff regime either. These were supposed to be populist moves, very much in sympathy with anxieties about China trying to rebuild manufacturing, but you think they're having the opposite effect. Explain that to us.
Let me start with where I agree with the current administration. I think manufacturing is important. I think that there are some aspects that should be done in the United States, and I think that there's a role that even things like tariffs can play in this process. As I mentioned earlier, for semiconductor manufacturing, some of that was already incentivized before Biden in the first Trump administration with tariffs. Now, how you go about it matters. And here's where I disagree very sharply with the current administration. What the current administration doesn't realize is the very things that it's attacking, whether it's American universities, like the one I'm at right now at Princeton, whether it's federal agencies connected to science and technology. You're thinking about funding from the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health, which are foundational to making the U.S. A leader in biotech and medical treatments. You think about a whole host of soft power groups, like obviously USAID in terms of U.S. foreign policy. I would argue that these contribute, forget about argument about values and about whether you agree with the climate and some of these institutions, I would argue that they contribute fundamentally to American national power, and that attacking them in the way that this administration has undermines, not supports, our ability to compete with China. So it's our lead to lose, is what I try to argue, that the US actually has a lot of strengths, that there's a reason why so many of the best and brightest scientists, researchers, entrepreneurs, they come to the United States, they come to Silicon Valley or the Boston area or New York or, all over. And like I mentioned, they found the next Google or NVIDIA. There's a reason for that. And that's because of the support that we give through these institutions.
So the argument there is the Trump administration and a hell of a lot of voters are really angry with and do not like the culture in organizations like the university or at Princeton or USAID, let's say. They think they've gone DEI crazy, they're not pursuing the kind of values that most people hold, and the federal government needs to clip their wings to bring them back to sanity. What you're saying is that actually that attack or cutting off that funding is going to pretty quickly reduce American power and potentially reduce American jobs, reduce American industry, and reduce Americans' ability to compete with China and win this crucial race.
Exactly. I just think there's so much that Americans take for granted that we will always be number one. And we forget that a lot of that is based on these things happening in the background, including the work of the civil servants, the work of the Department of Energy and the national labs going on in the background. These are the things that don't make headlines. They're not reported often in the regular news. They're not talked about because they're just not as flashy and exciting as perhaps the latest NVIDIA chip, for example. And yet those are really the foundations for everything else that we take for granted, including American power globally.
And it's a kind of philosophical schism, even on the political right, I would say. There is a lot of sympathy with what you're saying, which is the government does need to be involved. It needs to support domestic industry, erect barriers where necessary. It needs to be kind of an activist part of industry. But there's also the libertarian strand in which government is seen as just getting in the way. It represents bureaucracy, red tape, rules that holds commerce and entrepreneurism back. And those things haven't really been resolved, are they? Even you take figures like J.D. Vance, the vice president, it's like he holds both of those ideas at the same time. He kind of hates government, part of him, it seems, but he also really wants a bigger government to try and do some of the things you're talking about. Do you think there's a sort of conundrum going on there?
Yes, absolutely. I think you nailed it. I think these are issues that don't fall neatly in along party lines. They're not really a Democrat versus Republican thing. They're not even really like a Trump versus anti-Trump thing. There's something else. And I think there actually is, and this is what I argue towards the end of the piece, I actually think there is broad consensus on the value of, say, public spending, like DARPA, for example, of trying to seed the next wave of emerging technologies, of humanoid robots and investment in that kind of research. I think that is widely actually valued. And so I think we get this disconnect here where they become sort of politicized. They end up falling into sort of the usual left-right divide, when in fact, I think we're fairly unified in terms of wanting to compete, wanting to do well globally, and wanting to create jobs in the United States.
And to do that, perhaps there needs to be a bit of both. There does need to be cutting. There does need to be clearing away red tape, helping entrepreneurs, etc., which is reducing the role of government job. But simultaneously, with your kind of strong arm, you want to be investing in and helping industry. So I can see why it's confusing people, because we kind of want government to be doing both, getting smaller and bigger at the same time.
Absolutely. Yes. It's so funny. I find myself agreeing with and promoting at the same time, like Cato, very libertarian publications arguing against, say, policies that hamper American shipbuilding, red tape that really keeps us from being able to operate at our maximum, while at the same time also agreeing with, it doesn't even matter sort of where the leaning of the think tank is. You can kind of pick and choose, but I think there's broad consensus that we need to do more of the good stuff and do less of the bad stuff. It's as simple as that.
I'm going to try and challenge in a moment your central thesis, but before we do that, lay out for us where we could be in, let's say, 30 years' time. If current trajectories continue, what might the world look like?
This is, I think, at the heart of the piece, because I'm trying to paint a picture of not just what's happening now, but this trend going forward. And what I see, if things go forward, if China continues, which I believe it will, doubling down on its industrial policy, on advanced manufacturing, on pouring investment into high-tech sectors, and at the same time, the United States is cutting back public spending, not trying to do the hard work of making its bureaucracy more streamlined, things like that, then what I see by 2030 or a few decades out is a lot of the industries that we used to take for granted here in the United States moving to China. If we thought that the first China shock was bad, I think this would be on a whole different order of magnitude. And I'm talking about everything from the auto industry, which still to this day, if you include also auto components, still employs millions of people in the United States, creates a tremendous amount of economic value. We're talking about even potentially commercial jets, right? So China is going full steam ahead on trying to build its own commercial jets, the C919, for example, trying to compete at this moment where Boeing is feeling especially vulnerable. And you have a whole host of other, medical equipment, all these industries, again, that we feel like are just going to be American in the long run, are going to be moved over to China. And that gives China not only the jobs, but crucially, the geopolitical leverage. And I try to project some of the things that we're doing with China today. And what happens if we turn the tables? What happens if China's the one with control over choke points in our semiconductor industry or choke points in our commercial airline industry? What happens when China has the upper hand technologically and can decide, they don't like our tariffs, then they're going to crush our commercial airline business. So that's what I'm talking about when it comes to the stakes. It's not just jobs, that's very important. It's not just sort of sheer economic value that's, being won or lost, but also sort of this broader international geopolitical competition that's playing out as we speak.
So it's not only that America might lose that geopolitical battle and become an inferior power to China, China's tentacles will reach all the way onto domestic soil, in a sense. And America would almost, in that scenario, become a kind of client state of China because they would have control over all their crucial industries.
Yeah, if the U.S. doesn't step up, if the U.S. starts to retreat and starts to allow China to become the dominant player, not just economically, but in a geopolitical sense, we have a lot to lose in terms of American values, American interests. Absolutely.
Okay, I'm now going to argue against you for a moment, and you can just bat away these counter-arguments. So the most common one you hear, why what you're saying is panic, or it is Sino-utopianism or something like that, is that China's got problems. China's economy has problems. We can put a chart on the screen for those people watching. The last 3 years, American GDP growth has exceeded China's nominal GDP growth. That's the first time that's happened in a while, and we're just at the end of 3 successive years of that. We've got a debt to GDP ratio nearing 300%. This is according to the IMF. So they got an increasing debt problem. And of course, they also have this demographic problem where, because of the one-child policy, but also normal demographic trends, their working age population is shrinking and shrinking relative to the overall population, just like it's happening in Western countries. So isn't China now just going to face its own economic crisis?
Yeah, the problems you laid out are very real and very serious and do constrain China's ability to grow economically, to compete with the United States, and to follow that sort of trajectory that I was talking about earlier. So, to take each of them in turn. So it is true. Right now, the Chinese economy is slowing. What normally looks like a recession to other countries, that is negative GDP growth, it doesn't show up in the same way in the numbers in China, but the feeling, the effects are very similar. You have really a cratering of real estate values, in a sense by design, because there was a bubble. There was overinvestment in a lot of housing, a lot of buildings that weren't really being used, that were being used as a store of wealth, as an investment, with the hopes that they would continue to rise in value. And that couldn't go on forever. So there was a deliberate effort to at least not support this so heavily going forward. And that caused a huge shock. I think actually in some ways a bigger shock than even the Trump tariffs, say. And so you've seen that on top of what was before then even a slowing economy. Again, you have no longer the China of the double-digit growth years in the 90s and 2000s, but maybe 5%, and that's if you take that number at its word. Demographics is another huge issue. And what's happening is you have an aging population, you have a declining workforce, you have obviously overall a shrinking population, and you have fewer workers to work the factories. You have, rising wages. That can be obviously a very good thing for the workers, but that also means you have constraints on labor costs, on production. Now, China's trying to deal with that by doubling down on automation. And so that's where I see what I call a sort of Schumpeterian creative destruction process happening, where they see the writing on the wall. They know that the demographics don't look good, that the labor force is not going to be as strong as it used to. And the only way to fill the gap and to stay competitive internationally is to make that investment, make that painful switch. And there's a lot of blowback to rising automation. Even I mentioned the rise of autonomous vehicles in China. There's a lot of taxi drivers who hate this idea, as they do in many other parts of the world, or delivery drivers who were already pushed out of whatever job forced them into being a delivery driver, and now they don't even have that job. So there's definitely a lot of discontent. There's a lot of resentment.
Kyle, it sounds like you were agreeing with me there. So it's not so great after all. I mean, your essay, your thesis is that China is like racing ahead to be the dominant force and US is kind of being left in the dust. But what you've just described is a whole series of major problems.
And yet, at the same time, China is going all in on these industries of the future. Both can be true at the same time. While the fiscal capacity might be more constrained, while the amount of firepower from, say, the central government and especially the local governments burdened by debt may weigh down on what they're able to do and whether they're able to realize some of their big ambitions as quickly as they want to, I think directionally, they are really, really focused on these industries of the future. They are really, really focused on becoming a manufacturing powerhouse. And I think that is not going away, on top of building this whole ecosystem of research and development that stretches from the universities there, Tsinghua, Beida, Zhejiang University, where the DeepSeek founder went, to government research labs. You have the Chinese Academies of Sciences. You have research labs across the private tech firms, Huawei probably being the most famous. So this forms actually a very robust science and technology ecosystem that fuels China's advances in a lot of these related fields.
The second most common argument against is underestimate America at your peril, right? A lot of people have been saying, it's the end of the American era. That's been around for a while. And every time people say that, it doesn't seem to happen because there's a new surge of innovation. I mean, the statistics on investment alone, $250 billion in venture capital invested in 2024 compared to 70 billion or thereabouts in China. So from where I'm sitting in Europe, which we haven't even bothered talking about because it's so irrelevant in this conversation, we're all terrified about America because our successful students or companies or people who want to make some innovation happen at scale, they want to go to America. They're not saying, can we go to China? America remains the hub. It remains has that pull factor, and it's where the money is. So why is that wrong?
Where I think I disagree is that this idea that America will just always continue to win, that American universities will always continue to be number one, where the U.S. economy will always be the largest in the world, where the latest advances in AI will happen here in the United States first and then get fast followed perhaps by China. That, I think, is an assumption that we base on sort of historical patterns, but history is not a good way to predict the future. There could be turns, there could be changes, turning points that we're seeing right now. And that's where the piece really is driving at, that we are at an inflection point, not just in terms of individual industries or sectors, but in terms of how we approach the very bedrock of what made America a superpower in the first place. So that is something that I think hasn't been challenged, especially when you look at other sort of aspects of American power that are now coming into question, like the dominance of the U.S. dollar. So, it's still early days and a lot can happen. But I think even just the questioning of whether some of these American sort of pillars will be there in the future, that already is bringing a whole new set of thinking, I think, that people haven't really considered before.
My third counter argument for you is that pretty much what you're suggesting is happening. Investors are trying to disinvest now from China. You see that happening. Companies are led by Apple, and we could talk a lot about what Apple has done in the past, but they are also trying to relocate some of their processes to other countries other than China. There is a sense that people have woken up to this threat, and everyone from the corporations to the federal government are thinking of ways to disentangle from Chinese dominance. So that train is in motion, and investors are following suit. It feels like there is energy in exactly the direction you're talking about. And yes, you may not like the way that President Trump went about tariffs, but they're certainly waking people up to the fact that America is not going to sit there and allow its technology and expertise just to drain away to China. So the Kyle Chan prescription is sort of happening.
It's sort of happening a little bit, but I argue it's too little too late in many ways. So specifically, when it comes to bringing back manufacturing, I mean, as you mentioned, a lot of that manufacturing is not coming back to the United States. It may be de-risking or diversifying away from China, but it's going to places like India or Vietnam, or maybe, if Europe is lucky, parts of Europe for electric vehicles, for example. The U.S. is not really seeing that return in manufacturing, at least in the months that the second Trump administration has been in power. So I think what you're seeing is, yes, people who are concerned. You see certainly a sense that our sheer dependence on Chinese supply chains may not be a healthy one in the long run, that there are serious vulnerabilities there that could put us in a difficult position in the future, even in the near term. But the real question is, are people taking action? And are the factories really popping up here again, especially, as I mentioned, in those strategic industries? It doesn't have to be, as President Trump says, the dolls or the iPhones. They don't need to be manufactured here per se. But I would argue a whole host of other industries, it does make sense to make sure that we either bring them back or we keep them here. And I see that right now, that's not necessarily the trend that's happening.
Final question for you, Kyle. It's a kind of big picture one. Do you think this is possible to avert at all? I mean, a lot of people hearing this will just think cultures and civilizations go up, they reach a peak, and then they fade away. Everything is always in motion. And yes, we had the American century. Inevitably now, things are moving on, and those other cultures and parts of the world are going to have a new moment. And there's really not a lot we can do about it. We are divided. We are weak. We can't even agree on anything internally. Just, is it conceivable that the West, led by the US, changes this trajectory?
Yes, I do think it is, because I think we're really more at an inflection point, more at a fork in the road than anything else. Obviously, the piece is trying to paint a strong picture for what a potential future could look like. But I argue that's what a potential future could look like. That's not a pure prediction of how things will turn out. So that's why I see this moment as being so pivotal for us to stop doing the sort of self-harm, self-damage that has been happening with this current administration, for us to actually recognize the many strengths, and by us I mean the United States, the West more broadly, actually realize the many strengths that we have been enjoying and benefiting from for years, if not decades. Again, it also goes back to a culture of free speech, of free inquiry, of being able to explore new fields, new areas, and to get that kind of backing through the broader sort of ecosystem of private and public support. I think that's all really crucial, and I think it's our lead to lose ultimately. That it's not preordained that China will win or that the U.S. will win. That it really is in our hands.
Sometimes I say we should get you back in 3 months or a year when people are making speculations about forthcoming elections. Really, we need to speak in 50 years, Kyle. I mean, I hope we see you before that. But if we're both still around, let's say 30 years from today, I'm going to set a note using some kind of Chinese technology in my iPhone to remind me. And maybe we could talk again because it will be fascinating to see whether that happens. Kyle Chan, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
That was Kyle Chan, a researcher in all things China and Chinese industry. His essay that we were talking about there was entitled, "In the Future, China Will Be Dominant, the US Will Be Irrelevant." Well, by the end there, I feel like there was a little sliver of hope that if they make certain policy decisions, the US and the West more broadly might reach a different future. But certainly this is the big one. I mean, we can all forget the culture war issues for a while. We can forget these angels on the head of a pin arguments that we spend a lot of time discussing, because this, it really feels like, is the big one. Thank you to Kyle Chan, and thanks for tuning in. This was UnHerd.